War Stories, Another Small World by Leonard J. Odell, October 2000. This isn't a war story about some super spectacular mission over China during World War II, because it's not. The narrative starts as a not-so-typical combat mission and ends up in a marvelous series of coincidences that occurred many years later. Part 1, Walkout Report. On October 4, 1944, 4 P-51 Mustangs took off at 6:15 from Luqiao Air Force Base in China for a dive bomb and strafe mission along the West River between Wuchao and Taking in southeast China. Our flight leader was Lieutenant Myron Sees, his wingman Lieutenant Robert Raymond, with element leader Lieutenant Alfred Baker and I on his wing. The weather was operational all the way. In the target area, a number of troop barges were found in the river, and we commenced our dive bombing runs. Following our runs on the targets, the second element went down on the deck and individually made strafing passes at targets of opportunity along the north bank of the river, flying in a westerly direction, while the first element remained alert as top cover. The writer was in the process of strafing troop barges moored along the north bank, flying at about 50 foot off the water, when the first element radioed, "There's 5 Tojos coming down on them, and 5 more coming in to attack," to lower element. I immediately climbed slightly to get out of the narrow valley, looked around, and there sat 2 Japs right on my tail. I hit full emergency throttle, but where could I go? I cooled up above tree level, tried several hard turns, left and right, generally in the southerly direction towards the hill country, but they stuck with me. The whole episode took less than a minute, with 50 caliber slugs exploding on my armor plate and other parts of the plane. One shell tore off the right side engine cowling. Another opened up about an 8-inch diameter hole in the left wing, about 12 inches from the cockpit, and several hit behind the cockpit, generally tearing up everything to the rear, including the radio and the plane's cooling system, which let go and drenched me with antifreeze. Nothing seemed to help, so I momentarily chopped the throttle completely, and the 2 Tojos whizzed on past me. Good riddance. In our pre-flight briefing, we were told that everything north of the river was well controlled by the Japanese army, whereas the hill country to the south was only sparsely occupied by enemy troops. And if any problems occurred, we were advised to head out into the hill country. That's exactly what I did. The engine temperature immediately started to rise, and I knew that engine failure was imminent. By the time I got the canopy open, I was probably 5 or 10 miles south of the river. Well into hill country, and at about 200 feet altitude, with speed steadily decreasing, I gave a frantic leap out of the cockpit and unfortunately hit the horizontal stabilizer with my left leg as I passed by. I immediately pulled the ripcord. The parachute popped open with one big jerk. The plane crashed and I hit the ground. Actually a soft landing, but only about 50 yards from the burning plane, which crashed and exploded just beyond a small hill. I was fairly well bruised up getting out of the plane, but quickly gathered up the chute, cut off the jungle pack, and crammed the rest of it into a nearby mud hole as a temporary hiding place. Forgetting my ankle that had already started to swell, I ran up the hill along a small path heading in the south direction, hopefully away from the river. Along the way, numerous hoof marks were noted in the path that seems to indicate the presence of Japanese soldiers. After a short time, I came around a bend and almost ran into a man dressed in a blue blouse and black trousers. We each took one look at each other, and both of us took off in the opposite direction. At that point, I was too tired and my ankle hurt too much to travel a great deal further, especially not knowing what might come of the recent meeting. So I took off across a rice paddy that was partially flooded and found some dense bush overhanging the paddy that provided an excellent hiding place. After crawling in, I was concealed but almost completely submerged. Shortly after choosing this spot, voices were heard nearby, but I was unable to see without being seen from above. I remained lying down and immobile as they searched the area. At 9 o'clock, an hour and a half after going down, a flight of Mustangs passed overhead, going east, but there was no way for me to alert them. At 11 o'clock, one of the searchers called out in broken English, "Hey Joe, come on out!" Uncertain about their nationality, I remained quite in my hiding place. At 1300, the same call was repeated, with the addition of the words, "We've Chinese." But again I remained where I was, on my back in the water. while the searchers beat the bushes all around me. At 1500, the call was repeated. By this time, I had woven the bushes together so that I could move about slightly and look out without being seen, and rising up to watch 4 men in what appeared to be coolie clothes climb the hill and disappear along a trail around the other side of the rice paddy. Everything was quiet after 1500, and I made up my mind to stay the night in my rice paddy hiding place. But by 1800, it had become so cold that I decided to empty the usable material out of the jungle pack and set out along the path that the searchers had taken. After walking a short distance, my ankle hurt so much that it was decided to hide in a clump of ferns and wait until someone came along that might be of help. It wasn't long before 2 coolies came down the path, and I held out my blood-chit Chinese flag for identification. They were startled, but apparently understood. They helped me walk down into the valley. Approximately 2 miles from where I was lying, the 3 of us came to a village, but the coolies wanted to continue on, probably to their homes. It wasn't long, however, until the Hey Joe boy and several others from another village caught up with us, lugging along a large picture of the Generalissimo as assurance that they were Chinese. As soon as the general rejoicing had died down somewhat, the boy who had called previously introduced himself as Luke Yan Kwok, previously a houseboy in Quaylin's Hostel No. 4, Quaylin FB, who had only that day succeeded in getting across the river, having walked out of Quaylin. Small world. Luke acted as interpreter and introduced me around, although Luke himself was pretty much of a stranger in these parts. The Chinese villagers made a great show and to-do of me. Apparently, they had never seen a white man before. I was taken to the village magistrate, and my shoe was removed, the swollen ankle examined, and a doctor sent for. In the interim, some drinks were served, which, due to their potency, acted nearly as an anesthetic anyway. Bathwater was supplied as I was mud from head to foot, and full advantage was taken of this luxury. A blouse and some tattletale gray shorts were provided while my own clothes were being cleaned. At their beckoning, all identification, personal property, and insignia, with the exception of my dog tags, were removed and secured inside my clothes, and then the Chinese doctor showed up to look at the injured ankle. The foot was massaged and painted with some local remedy. Then hard-boiled eggs and tea was served, along with the story of the villagers having only the day before had a fight with 100 bandits and had been successfully in killing several. It was learned that there were many of these bandits along this stretch south of the river, both east and west of Wujiao. Most of them were deserters of the Chinese army and preyed on the small towns along the way. As a consequence, everyone I met was armed with old rifles, homemade hand grenades of 2 types, and with pistols. They said that they could hold their ground and fought the bandits, but when the Japs came in, they moved out. A mosquito net was given to me, and I gave the magistrate my flying gloves after he asked for a souvenir of my visit. Just before leaving, my newly acquired short pants were exchanged for a longer pair of the doctor's. All the while, the town fathers were deciding where I should go, and they were preparing a sedan chair and enlisting coolies to carry it. With 4 villagers as guards, we set out traveling west. After going about 2 miles, 8 more guards turned up and fell in with the first group going ahead as scouts. The hills over which we traveled were not high, but were difficult walking. All along the way, they had to give passwords by using bamboo torches and signaling from hill to hill. Had they not done so, Luke, who went along as interpreter, told me other villagers ahead would have shot them. Late that night, we arrived at a small town where they were supposed to find the nephew of General Li, who was the power in this area. But on finding that the nephew was gone, we continued on to the next village and to a large house, the home of Mr. Chow, an evacuee from Wujiao and an ex-Hong Kong teacher of English, who, it was learned, held a BA and MA degree. Here too were Mr. Li, the nephew who had left school in Quaylin as the Japs advanced, and Mr. Yao, a lieutenant colonel in the Chinese army, now Secretary To General Li, and previously to the Military Affairs Committee in Quaylin, plus another man and his wife, refugees from Hong Kong and Quaylin. While my difficulties were being explained, they got more food for me and served wine while they discussed among themselves what should be done. Previously, Luke had agreed to accompany me all the way out, but here he asked to be relieved as he was seeking His wife, whom he believed to be somewhere in the area. He did not seem too anxious to come out anyway. Mr. Yao made a big show of volunteering for the job at that point. Luke later left, heading back, but gave me the name of his brother-in-law, who lives in Texas, and asked that I write to him at his address in Texas. The remainder of the night was spent in conference and conversation amongst the Chinese hosts. I supplied those that were not in the planning session with news of the outside world, and showed them the various articles in the Jungle Pack and how they were used. During the 3 days' stay at this house, I was made as comfortable as possible, although sleeping on the floor in the attic. My biggest problem here was fighting the fleas that infested the attic. They seemed to like an Anglo diet. Another problem was absolutely no one remaining that spoke English, and it was imperative that I stayed out of sight. 2 very meager Chinese meals per day consisting of watered-down rice with some vegetables were provided. The high of the day, or rather the night, occurred after dark, when I was able to sneak outside with one of my hosts and bath in a nearby creek. The mosquito bar provided earlier was really a blessing, as the mosquitoes were thick in this area. The time in the evenings was spent mainly in talk, and it was learned that only 2 days before my arrival that the Japs had stormed through this town. The Chinese answer to this was to take everything movable from their homes and go into the hills until the Japs had moved on. The evidence of their passing, however, was everywhere visible in the destruction wrought on real property. The Japs take everything they can lay their hands on, especially food. The Chinese citizens usually have sufficient warning of the Jap approach because the inevitable dogs around all the little villages set up a continual howl when the Japs are moving. And on the proximity of the agitated dogs, the Chinese gauge their movements. They also noted that the Japs usually traveled in groups, averaging 300 along the south bank and slightly inland from the river. They travel at night. At that particular time, there were a number of nips just 10 miles from where I was staying, but due to the mountainous terrain and trusty dogs, my hosts said that there was plenty of warning should the Japanese care to come this way. During my stay there, the borrowed clothes were sent back to the doctor, and my host gave me 2 new sets. The 2 coolies who first made contact with me asked for a reward, but were told that I had already left, and from that time on in this town, no one but the residents in this particular house knew that I was still there. On the morning of the 2nd day, Mr. Sang, a representative of General Lee, arrived. Mr. Sang, it was discovered, held a PhD degree from Columbia, spoke excellent English, and had been a professor in a Canton university. He brought a gift of most welcome English Players cigarettes from the general, and divulged the disheartening belief that it might not be possible, due to the situation, to get me out for 6 months, or possibly until after the war. However, he did bring news that another pilot who had gone down was safe, and the general thought it wise not even to try to get out until the 2 of us met and could make the attempt together. Needless to say, I was not all that pleased at this prospect, although I was in favor of joining the other pilot before starting out. This was delayed slightly because there were Japs at the town of Dosan between the 2 of us. The Japs, it was discovered, left the town shortly afterwards, but according to the information received from local Chinese, the 80 puppet troops left behind had a raping good time before they moved on a couple days later. Rape and such carryings on were the usual procedure when Japs and their satellites enter the Chinese towns. On the night of the 3rd day, the elder brother of General Lee came as a second emissary from the general, and we discussed the situation through an interpreter. It was finally decided that I should be taken immediately to meet with the other pilot, and that the final decision would be left until the 2 of us could hold an audience with General Lee. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I was provided with such necessities as a towel, a toothbrush, and extra sandals, and the party started out for Watlam, where we expected to find the other pilot. On leaving, I was told that there were only 2 things to worry about on the journey. One was the Japs, who the Chinese said could easily be avoided, and second were the Chinese bandits, concerning whom the Chinese showed much trepidation. I was told that if captured by bandits, one might by giving everything to them, pleading for mercy and possibly be spared. But if carrying arms of any kind when caught, it was sure death. Thus my .45 Army-issue pistol was left at the house in which I had been staying. Thus, at 2 o'clock, there were 3 sedan chairs provided, one for the elder brother, one for the nephew, and one for me, plus 5 guards to accompany us on our journey. Only one stop for any length of time that occurred was to discuss the possibility of landing a light plane on 2 side-by-side tennis courts. I immediately vetoed this suggestion. Not long after this, we stopped to rest momentarily at a town named after its larger counterpart across the river, Taking. This village was a mess, having been host to numerous Japanese. After a short delay, we traveled on and at 09 o'clock arrived at the village at which the meeting was to take place. Shortly after arriving, I was taken to a small building where I met Lieutenant Alan Putnam of the 26th Fighter Squadron. Our host while staying here was General Lee's son, P.K. Lee, and his wife Lydia, who were temporarily taking refuge in this village. There was general rejoicing and considerable hilarity as Putnam and I viewed each other in our Chinese garb. Mr. Lee spoke excellent English, and it was quite reassuring to be able to talk to both him and Putnam after several days of communicating mostly by sign language. It was learned that Putnam had been shot down a day or so prior to my going down. There were about a dozen persons staying in this small building, including Mr. Lee's 1-year-old son, and all slept on the dirt floor, so one more person didn't make much difference. The festive mood was considerably enhanced by the presence of another Chinese doctor who insisted on imitating Charlie Chaplin. Another of the general's nephews, a Mr. Lee, who was so helpful in getting Major James Williams, former CO of the 76th Fighter Squadron, out of Hong Kong last December, and a Chinese chemical engineer, plus a slightly cracked Chinese artist who had studied and worked 40 years in New York and claims to have designed the Chinese national flag, and whose parting remark was "See you in Times Square." The next day, the party, including Putnam and me, went to visit General Lee in his mountain hideout that was well guarded from the Japanese. General Lee was introduced as being a member of the Chinese Military Affairs Committee and on the Military Advisory Council, formerly stationed in Kuelin. He wanted especially to be remembered to General Vincent and General Lindsay if and when Putnam and I returned to our bases. He also told us of his tentative plans for fighting in the area with guerrillas organized from the local populace, and what role the U.S. Air Force would have in these plans in the way of dropping supplies and arms to them. He went into considerable detail and sent an explanatory letter to General Lindsay to be delivered by Lieutenant Putnam. He also discussed the possibility of Putnam and me walking out, and when we said that we very much preferred to leave right away, he said that it would be arranged as soon as possible, and he chose Lieutenant Cole Yao as the supervisor of the venture. Lieutenant Cole Yao would not be, it is understood, too happy about the choice, and is presently disobeying orders to return immediately by making plans of his own to put himself in the service of the CAF. A messenger was sent off to notify Cole Yao to come to General Lee, and also he was requested to bring back my GI shoes that were left behind with my clothes. I had learned the hard way that the Chinese sandals furnished were nearly impossible to walk in. General Lee spent most of the next day and one half making the necessary arrangements for the trip and writing 10 or more letters to be carried and used to obtain assistance along the way. He also furnished expense money on an account of which was to be kept by Cole Yao, who was to continue on to Chungking to be reimbursed. In the meantime, P.K. Lee's mother obtained a supple of black cotton cloth and fabricated a suit of Chinese fashion clothes me, same as she had done for Putnam. This included a blouse and a pair of pants, complete with a drawstring, plus a set of underpants. Mrs. Lee did a wonderful job on very short notice. We were also given pith helmets, which were customarily worn by Chinese gentlemen. This was probably done to order to hide Putnam's blonde hair that would be a dead giveaway. But then, one doesn't see many 6-foot-tall Chinese gentlemen either. We had our perfect disguise, except for our GI shoes that were considered a necessity. Putnam's Chinese suit is presently on display in the Air Museum at Warner Robins AFB, whereas I still have mine. We said our many thanks for their hospitality and goodbyes to PK and Lydia, and off we went. On the first part of the day of the march, we walked only 3 hours, partially because my ankle began to bother me considerably, and it took a while to rig up a sedan chair to carry me. Tea was served in a small village at 1700 that afternoon. This village had very recently been evacuated of the populace due to the Japs passing through, and they had not as yet returned. The town was nearly torn to pieces. After resting a short while, we went over the hill to another village, which apparently had not been lucky enough to receive early warning of the Nips' approach, and as a result, a goodly proportion of their female population was missing, their heads having been shaved and them having been bodily carried off by the bringers of the new and enlightened order. In addition to the women, 150 children had been allowed to tag along with the Jap soldiers, according to those that remained, as potential blood donors to the wounded Japanese soldiers. The natives were, however, most cordial in their reception of our party, and provided us with what they could in the way of food, including an undoubted delicacy, roasted hornets. These tasted like parched corn and were devoured with relish by Putnam and me, until the room lamps were lit and it allowed us to see what we were consuming. At this point, we suddenly lost our appetites. It was not necessarily this particular diet that caused it, but at this stage of the journey, both Putnam and I developed mild cases of dysentery that hung on for the entire trip, causing considerable discomfort. After trying to sleep on the floor with brick pillows that night, we were glad to be off early the following day. This was necessary to keep up with the rigid schedule that General Lee had set. It was required that approximately 25 miles be covered per day, or average nearly 2.5 miles an hour while walking through the hills. And it was necessary to avoid the more obvious and consequently more dangerous avenues of travel. This walking over difficult terrain added to my still painful ankle and made it necessary, part of the time, to ride in a sedan chair. No matter, it was a hard day's work. At several places, we stopped at villages tucked away in the hills where it was obvious that no white man had previously been seen. Lieutenant Putnam's age was variously put at 45 to 60 due to his blonde hair. At one stop, though, evidence of contact with the outside world was noted by the presence of several bottles of cherry crush, as produced by a Shanghai firm before the war, and apparently it was kept for such an occasion as the arrival of 2 American pilots. The soft drink was equally as good as the pomelos and eggs that formed the rest of the snack. Also, it was amazing to see that the village headman had a cane that was made of a gun barrel, fitted so that it could be fired. And we also noted that the guards in this area had dum-dum bullets that were carried in their gun clips. At this time, too, the residents were just putting things back together after the Jap troops had crashed through. The first things the Japs had to repair when they came in, and what the natives worked on when they left, were the phone wires that seemed to always be out of commission. Along the route in one place, patches of armed Chinese, not regular troops or guerrillas, were seen scattered out through the hills. It was said that they were trying to locate and raise havoc with 300 Japanese, whose passage had been observed along the same route, being taken by our escape party. It was in the area just east of Shumkai that outcrops of coal were noted. For a poor country with little natural energy resources, here was a place where abundant raw materials were present, just for the digging. Reminiscent of my West Virginia home state. From here on, the travel was somewhat easier and more pleasant. Our party stayed one day with a Chinese millionaire, Mr. Wong Kin Fan, whose large family included several concubines who entertained us with good food and accommodations, plus a song fest in which numerous Chinese songs were sung, including their national anthem and several marching songs. Putnam and I reciprocated with the Star-Spangled Banner, Home on the Range, paper doll, and the artillery's caisson song. All in this naturally protected section of the country had a pleasant time. It was learned that Mr. Wang was planning to guard his estate even better by training a number of soldiers and establishing a small garrison. We were told that the Japanese were not very far from this home, but had not as yet discovered it, or at least had not tried to enter the area. 8,000 Jap troops, it was claimed, had come up in two groups using different routes from Fort Bayard and had joined near the river before moving west and north. It was mentioned that these Japanese had been considerably less forward and destructive in their advance than had been those from the east, leaving receipts for everything they stole, and assuring the natives that these would be honored in full by the government after the war. At Zhengyun, we met a Father McKay who had the Catholic mission in that town. He took good care of us while we were in this town. He also told us of the U.S. Air Force, 26th Fighter Squadron. Bombing the town, evidence of considerable destruction wrought was still plainly visible. The father said that the Chinese had evacuated the town as the Japs came in, and that they had all had a ringside seat for the air attack from a nearby hill. The number of Japs killed was only 6 men, so far as he knew, because the Japs were bivouacked on the outskirts of the town rather than in it. However, he did know that on the 11th of October, at about 13 hours, 2 Mustangs of the 26th on a recon along the river to the north had caught a large number of Japs crossing the river and had strafed and killed 300 men and 7 horses. The residents of the town wanted the father to express their appreciation to the Air Force through the 2 of us. Actually, the Japanese had not ransacked the town, but the Chinese themselves had caused a great deal of damage by looting prior to the re-entry of the residents. During our stay in Zhengyun, a British captain and a sergeant joined our party temporarily. They were coming up from the region around the north end of the Luqiao Peninsula. They had operated a weather reporting station, probably in connection with the British military mission. They were both of great assistance to us, as they spoke Chinese and knew the country. In return, our presence made it not only more pleasant for the British, but helped them, as it seemed that the British were not too much appreciated by the natives in this section. We were guests at several banquets given by the town officials and the military brass. These affairs went off well, with a very happy and alcoholic time being had by all. Many daring tales of escapes from Canton and Hong Kong entertained us during the remainder of the trip, as told by both whites and Chinese that we met. Many of the stories were hair-raising and some positively incredible. One Chinese told of the Japanese trying to cut off the civilians who were attempting to get out of Canton when the Nips occupied it. They were mowed down in the road, and those that were still alive were bayoneted where they lay. This particular fellow had jumped in a ditch, and fortunately for him, 2 of his companions had jumped on top of him. They were bayoneted and killed, but he, being protected by their bodies, was only slightly injured and managed to escape at night. One of the Hong Kong missionaries told of an attack at his mission. It seems that some of the Canadian defenders of the island had taken over his mission as a likely and defensible building. They were finally beaten down, and 24 were taken prisoner. Missionaries had been held but not killed, while soldiers were lined and tied up against the wall of the mission, and bayoneted rather than being shot or held prisoner. We were also told of some of the experiences of the fast Chinese motorboats which ran the blockade of the Hong Kong and Canton harbors to bring out badly needed food and other supplies. The Jap harbor patrol vessels often caught them, but other times they fought successful battles. On one occasion, one of the padres had gone along for the ride, and the motorboat was challenged by a small Japanese patrol ship. During the running fight, the padre was thrown overboard by a particularly violent maneuver, and he later observed that the Chinese boat was cut to ribbons and blown up not a half-mile further on. The padre was fortunate in being able to walk out later on. From here on west, the party grew, the ranks being swelled by Father Micaiah and later by 2 other missionaries. The only difficulties encountered were the continued dysentery and minor annoyances caused by typical Chinese inefficiency. Word got through from Zhengyun to Nanning that we were okay. Plus, arrangements were made with the 26th Fighter Squadron for a supply-dropping mission to bring us some of the items that were needed. The plane arrived on schedule and scored a bullseye with its loaded belly tank, using marker panels laid out on the outskirts of town to guide it in. The somewhat battered supplies of food, cigarettes, etc. were very much appreciated. We were treated to a scare when it was learned that the Japs were near Quaisian, southwest of Kuiping, and along our intended line of march. The route was varied slightly to detour around this area. But it was found out later that this information was not accurate. Numerous other banquets were given as the party proceeded by walking, by sedan chair, and by barge. The river travel was typical of the Chinese transportation system, numerous long waits being in order to catch the barge and secondly, to sweat out. The coolies or soldiers riding it, who at the crucial moment, when the tug was to start moving up the river, would decide it was time to scatter out along the bank and cook their dinner. Finally, with many trials and minor tribulations, the barge was pulled through the rather hazardous stretch of rapids, and the party was put aboard a good-sized river steamer. After 3 days, the steamer unloaded them at Nanning. We proceeded to the Nanning Air Force Base, where I bid Alan Putnam a fond farewell, and he returned to his squadron. Lieutenant Colonel Yao, who had accompanied us all the way during our walkout, and I boarded an Air Force shuttle plane and flew to Lihao Chao Air Force Base. Colonel Yao spent a couple hours visiting with me at my hostel and recapping our somewhat trying journey. He indeed kept a large ledger of the expenses encountered along the way and planned to report to Chongqing. After taking a few pictures, thanking him for a great job in guiding us back to our air bases, we said goodbye and he took his leave. I carried little money and actually found that in these particular circumstances, I had little need for it. However, I absolutely feel that the blood-jet Chinese flag was an indispensable necessity, and it was used frequently along the route. I had no pointy-talkie, and really had no great need for one, although I intend to carry one in the future. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have come out with only such minor inconveniences, such as the GIs and a slightly banged-up ankle. The walkout planning and guidance by the Chinese was excellent. Although the trip was strenuous, slow, and sometimes exasperating, but nonetheless, the producing way the Chinese handled a difficult and rather delicate situation was remarkable. Throughout the ordeal, they maintained a great outer calm, even though they had previously been severely hurt by the Japs, and were at every moment in danger of additional attacks either by them or by the Chinese bandits. To all those persons who participated in this undertaking, my eternal thanks. I returned to my squadron October 21st, 1944, after being away 17 days. Part 2, Small World, October 1996, 52 years later. An article appeared in the October 1996 issue of the 14th Air Force Association Jingbao Journal newsletter. This article is reprinted here. Small World. The following is from P.K. Lee of Roseville, Minnesota, and Lieutenant Alan Putnam, referred to in his story, 26th FS Miles, is a Tiger cousin and lives at 7814 Senrab Drive, Bradenton, Florida, 34209. This regards the rescue and sent to safety of 2 fighter pilots after they were shot down behind enemy line of South China in early 1945. The author played a very small role described here from memory. Since it occurred some 50 years ago, the description may not be accurate. A collaboration from the downed pilots would be helpful. The 2 pilots were shot down 1 or 2 weeks apart. The story deals mainly with the first downed pilot, Lieutenant Alan Putnam. As I was told by Lieutenant Putnam, after his P-51 was hit by enemy ground fire near Canton, Guangzhou, he managed to fly about 100 miles towards Kunming and had to parachute down near Wuchou, where the 2 rivers, Kuiqiang and Shunxiang, meet. It was fortunate that he landed south of Wuchou, where there were no Japanese troops. The villagers and the militia brought him to my father, who at the time, with the family, was staying in a mountain village hideout 30 miles southwest of Wuchou. Wuchou is our hometown. Since the militia brought Lieutenant Putnam to my father instead of the head of the village or county, a few words on father's history may be helpful and perhaps of some interest. Father at the time was semi-retired. He had once been very prominent in China, especially in South China, in the mid-1920s during the national campaign for unifying the country. Father was chief of staff under Chiang Kai-shek and doubled as commander of an army. After the successful unifying campaign in the late 1920s, Father was simultaneously an Army Corps commander and governor in Canton. During the early years of the Republic, Chiang was in control of the government. Even though Chiang proclaimed he was for democracy, his action showed otherwise. Father could not support Chiang and failed in repeated attempts to make Chiang change his ways. To solidify his rule and following the example of some of the Chinese rulers in the past, Chiang started to eliminate the feudatory princes, the military leaders who had contributed much to the founding of the regime. Father became his first target. In 1929, Chiang lured Father to Nanking, falsely accused him of treason, placed him under house arrest, so-called Tangshan incident, and dismissed Father of all posts. When Japan invaded China in 1931, Chiang kept yielding land to preserve his troops. In 1936, Chiang was kidnapped by two of his generals, the Xi'an incident. They said to Chiang, in effect, "Fight Japan or your life." Chiang could not mobilize the entire country to fight Japan. Father was appointed director of the Guilin office of the National Military Commission, overseeing the military operations of South China. But Father and 4 war zone commanders, 3 were his former subordinates, were handicapped. Chiang would not let Father have real power. Chiang also liked to manage the war from Chongqing, hundreds or thousands of miles away. During Father's tenure at Guilin, he met General Casey Vincent many times. Once Father was invited to give a talk at the Air Force Base at Guilin. Father pointed out the flaw in Chiang's war policy. His speech was well received by General Vincent and the other officers. During the banquet afterward, many officers brought their glasses to Father and ganbei, bottom up, with Father in praise of Father's ideas. Once Father invited General Vincent to our home in Guilin and showed him the Wei Qi, an ancient Chinese game of combat and strategy. It was during this occasion that I met General Vincent. In 1944, Father's office in Guilin was abolished. Father was promoted to the president of the Military Advisory Yuan with a lofty title but no power. Father was not anxious to go to Chongqing to be sworn in, not forgetting the Tangshan incident. So Father brought the family back to our hometown in Wuchao, 150 miles south of Guilin. When the Japanese took Wuchao, Father brought the family up the mountains. That was the situation under which Lieutenant Putnam. And later, the militia brought another downed pilot to Father. Father could help the pilots much more effectively than the village head, even though at the time, Father didn't really have an official function. When Lieutenant Putnam was brought to the mountain to see my father, I became an interpreter. Lieutenant Putnam was surprised to see a young Chinese fellow who could speak his language. I did not have a college degree. Father, in civilian clothes, greeted him and indicated he would do his best to get him back safely to the airbase at Kunming. The question was, how? Kunming is more than 500 air miles away, and the Japanese had occupied many of the towns in between. We discussed the possibility of picking him up by a plane. We inspected a nearby flat land as a possible place for landing a plane. Putnam thought the land was too bumpy. Besides, there was no way to contact the 14th Air Force Command at Kunming, and if the Japanese got word that there was a U.S. pilot hiding in our mountain village, they might not leave him alone. It was decided the only way was by walking. The operation must be well planned. The pilots walking through villages must be as non-conspicuous as possible to avoid attention. Someone that could speak English and could handle the villagers was needed as an escort. Putnam suggested I could be that person. But then, how do I get back from Kunming? Putnam suggested an airdrop. I was not too enthusiastic about that. Besides, I couldn't leave Father. Fortunately, one of Father's aides volunteered. He could speak a little English. This was also a chance for him to leave the mountain village. So it was decided I forgot his name, would escort Putnam to Kunming 1,000 walking miles away. Mother fetched some black cloth and ordered pajama-type Chinese clothes made for Putnam. It was about that time, I forgot his name too, another fighter pilot was shot down nearby and was again brought to father. So mother ordered another set of Chinese clothes made. Within days, the two pilots, in black pajama-type Chinese clothes, escorted by father's aide, who say, "Shall we go?" And then after saying goodbye and good luck, they were on their way. I remember seeing the two of them walking down the mountain road with arms swinging. Months later, we were happy to hear that they had safely reached Kunming. I understand they only had to walk to Nanning, 250 miles away, where a plane picked them up. Last year when I was in Destin, Florida, I mentioned this incident to Mr. Gaylord Hall, who tracked down Alan Putnam and got his phone number. Immediately I called him and he was surprised that he was talking to the young fellow he met some 50 years ago in a mountain village in South China after he was shot down. What a small world. Part 3, Another Small World. It was an amazing revelation to me to learn that Alan Putnam lived in Bradenton, Florida, and I was able to determine his phone number through directory assistance. We had a very delightful conversation. Reminiscing about the experience that we shared many years ago walking out of South China back to our home bases. Bradenton, Florida is quite some distance from my hometown of Louisville, California. However, I did have some old high school friends that were known to have moved to Bradenton after World War II. So I named the three of them, Paul Bartley, Carl French, and Doc Jarvis. Lo and behold, Alan said, "Why, I've played golf with the three of them every Wednesday for years." March 31st, 1996, Gaylord L. Hall. Dear Gaylord, many thanks for your letter of March 13th. It certainly contained a lot of long-forgotten information. Yes, it is a small world. In fact, it is unbelievable that you were able to come up with such a combination of incidences that occurred so long ago and to have involved such a large percentage of the world's population. It staggers the imagination to think that two individuals from an extremely remote village in China who were good enough to help return two unfortunate pilots to their home bases suddenly show up in this country and by coincidence tells the story to you. What do you suppose the odds of this happening might be? From what I can tell after reading the information that you sent me, P.K. Lee and his wife must, indeed, be the two people that Putnam and I stayed with for a day or so. My intentions are to write P.K. and explore the situation with him further to get the facts straightened out. In my head, I didn't realize that the general that he spoke of in the story was his father. It seems like we must have hiked about a half day to reach the hideaway compound where this general and his staff were located. I thought at the time that he was a much older person, but there again, anybody over 30 probably looked ancient to a 20-year-old country boy from West Virginia. Another coincidence, I recently learned from a friend of mine here in Louisville, who was in the Navy SACO unit, was attached to this very guerrilla organization. That particular time, he was down on the South China coast observing enemy operations around Canton. He described the mountain hideout well enough for me to concur it was the same place. Unfortunately, my good friend Art Wilding died this January. I'm sure that he would have enjoyed this story and likely would have recognized the name and photo of PK's father. It's possible that PK would recognize Art Wilding's name, and as such, I will include this in my letter to him. Another small world. I didn't know that there had existed the possibility that PK would accompany Putnam and me back to friendly territory. I couldn't blame him for not wanting to leave his wife in the backwoods of China. This fact was never mentioned to us. In looking through an old photo album, I find that I have a slightly faded picture of the gentleman that did accompany us. Fortunately, I wrote his name on the picture, Lieutenant Colonel Yao. Perhaps I can get a copy made and send it to PK. He may remember him. I don't remember much about Yao, except that he did a good job of keeping us moving westward through the hills and on to Nanning. We never encountered any Japs along the way, but somebody did take a shot at us once. We didn't hang around to find out who it was. Yao stayed with me, and we caught a flight from Nanning to Luqiao. He disappeared the day after we got to Luqiao. But I did hear later that he had kept track of all expenditures during our sojourn, and that the bill that he presented to the U.S. government was for $2 million, U.S. currency. I couldn't believe my ears. I don't recall that it was in Chinese currency. However, if it were in Chinese yen, the bill would only amount to $4,000 or 5,000 US, which wouldn't cover much. We had 8 or 10 people with us all the time, half soldiers and half laborers, bearers, for about 3 weeks. The bearers stopped every 3 to 4 hours at roadhouses and smoked a pipe full of opium. Of course, we had tea during these breaks. No kidding. I don't know who paid that bill, but the bearers sure did work well after that. Oh well, it probably got charged off to Lend-Lease after the war was over. This has been an interesting development, and I appreciate your part in getting the information around. I have already written Putnam and have received a reply from him. I sent him a little information on the 23rd Fighter Group reunion to be held in your hometown next October. My wife and I plan to be there for sure. Perhaps Putnam will make it. However, he didn't seem too enthusiastic about. I'll keep trying. In any case, I will give you a call, and perhaps you can join us at one of the functions, the hospitality suite for sure. I'll let you know what I learned from PK. There's got to more to the small world story. Maybe you or he can write chapter 2. For example, what happened to him during these past 52 years? Yours very truly, Leonard Odell, April 2nd, 1996. PK Lee. Dear PK, after reading an article in the 14th Air Force Association Jingbao Journal newsletter regarding the rescue of 2 downed pilots in China, written by Gaylord Hall, I wrote a letter to Gaylord and identified myself as the second pilot who you were unable to identify. Perhaps you have already heard from him, but nevertheless, I will proceed with this letter, as there are other facts that may be of interest to you. Gaylord sent me a copy of your article Small World, which I enjoyed reading very much. The story actually started the first week of October, 1944, in the early morning hours. We encountered several enemy aircraft over the city of Wuchou, and in the mix-up my plane received several damaging hits. I flew southwest about 5 miles away from the river before parachuting. After landing, I found an overgrown area alongside a rice paddy and stayed hidden until almost dark that evening. The first person that was seen after coming out of hiding was a Chinese farmer who took me to his village, a mile or so away, where I met with a local town official. I spent the next week hiding in the loft of a barn that was located next to a small stream. The only time that I came out was late at night sometimes to bath in the stream. This was the only pleasant part of my stay there. During that time, not one word of English was heard. However, we did learn to communicate fairly well by sign language. Apparently, the Japanese gave up looking for me, and the village official arranged to take me to a second village. This was to your residence. This is where I first met Alan Putnam, you and your mother. It was a most pleasant change, since English was spoken and everyone seemed to be rather jovial in spite of the dire circumstances. Everyone in the other village seemed to live an extremely hard life and never smiled or joked about anything. They must have been having a terrible time just subsisting because they had practically no food to live on. The only food that I remember eating was a soup made of water and a small amount of rice. I recall its Chinese name, but can only spell it phonetically, kanji. They certainly have my full sympathy for the conditions that they were enduring. I was immediately impressed with finding in such a remote location that you and your mother could speak relatively good English, and the biggest treat was the excellent food that was prepared for us. Another thing that impressed me, and I have told this story many times, was that either a relative of yours or a friend came over that first night and he spoke excellent English. He was an older gentleman with a beard who told us that he went to school in the United States at Columbia University in New York City. His stories were very interesting, and he entertained us by singing a song in English, My Blue Heaven. Do you remember this person? I recall hiking up into the mountains to the headquarters of the local military establishment and discussing how Putnam and I were to get back to our air bases. I didn't know at that time that the general that we spoke to was your father. You must have done a good job as interpreter because all arrangements worked out very well. Also, I didn't recall that you considered making the trip with us. However, your decision not to leave your family was certainly understandable. Incidentally, I still have the black pajama-type Chinese clothes that were made for me to wear during the return trip. In reviewing an old photo album from the war years, I discovered that I have a picture of myself and a Lieutenant Cole Yao, who was the person that accompanied us back to Nanning Air Base where Putnam was stationed. Cole Yao stayed with me and we went on Luqiao to the next day via military aircraft. He stayed in Luqiao for one more day before proceeding onward. The picture was taken on the air base at Luqiao about 1 month before the Japanese captured the base. The photo is rather faded, but I will try to get a reproduction made and will send it to you. Do you remember this, officer? We were delighted to have Colonel Yao guide us back to our air bases, and apparently he did a good job because there were no problems along the way. It was a hard trip, most of it walking along rural pathways through the mountains. We did spend 1 or 2 days on a riverboat, a sampan, and this was a welcome change. Even the pigs that were on board didn't bother us much. It is quite a coincidence that after 52 years, the story Small World should emerge about an incident that happened in such a faraway place. The remarkable part about it is that one person from the very large country of China should come to this country and somehow tell the story to someone that was able to connect these facts to individuals that are still living. What are the odds of this happening? Actually, it would be almost as improbable if it had happened 10 years ago. There is another possible coincidence that I would like to share with you. A longtime friend of mine that lived in Louisville was with the U.S. Navy SACO unit for several years while in China during World War II. For a good part of the war, he was involved in guerrilla activities with Chinese soldiers, conducting raids on enemy positions and doing surveillance and intelligence work. In discussing various activities in China with my friend Arthur Wilding, it was learned that he was attached to the insurrection group that had their headquarters in the same mountaintop village where you took us prior to our return trip. We compared dates and determined that Art was on a mission to observe enemy activity along the south coast of China at the time that Putnam and I were in your village. Art never mentioned the name of the general that was in command, but his description of the place fits very well with my memory of it. Unfortunately, Art died this past January. I'm sure he would have recognized your father's name. Do you recall an American by the name of Arthur Wilding? It really is a small world that we live in. My wife and I plan to go to Fort Walton Beach this coming October for a reunion of the 14th Air Force 23rd Fighter Group, and I expect to meet with Gaylord Hall sometime while there. We found out today that 2 or 3 people that I flew with in China were friends of his. That's also remarkable. He mentioned that you plan to spend part of the coming winter in Destin, Florida. Do you expect to be there in October? If so, we should get together and find out what other coincidences exist in this small world of ours. Give my best regards to your wife. Yours very truly, Leonard Odell, April 25th, 1996. PK Lee, Dear PK. It was certainly nice to receive your April 6th letter and to learn a little more about what has transpired with you in the last 52 years. I'm sure that there is a great deal of your large world that I haven't heard about. For instance, when did you come to the States? In what type work have you been involved? Why you choose Minnesota as your new home? Do you have family living in the States? Do you still have family in China? How often do you return to China? Etc. I'm just curious. You don't have to answer these questions if there's any problem. I should have answered your letter before now, but we have spent the last 2 weekends camping in our new RV. In fact, we are off again tomorrow to spend the weekend about 40 miles from Louisville with our regular camping club. Then, next week, we are off to Florida for a 3-week round-robin trip, which we have been looking forward to all winter. Spring has finally arrived in Kentucky, and the weather is almost agreeable, although it still has a few periods when it reverts to winter-like conditions. This weekend campout will be spent in a little town in Kentucky that has a dogwood festival. We have been there previously this time of year and have enjoyed it very much. Sorry that you will not be in Florida in October when we have our 23rd Fighter Group reunion. We plan to attend and expect to see Gaylord Hall while in Fort Walton Beach. This is a wonderful area, and we look forward to spending a few extra days while in the area. We would be delighted for you and your wife to stop by Louisville while on your way to Florida and visit with us. This should be a natural stop because it's about one hard day's drive from St. Paul. There is one problem. We may be in Florida ourselves at about the first of the year. We really haven't made any plans yet, but one of the places that we plan to visit during our trip to Florida in May is a potential site from winter camping in the Punta Gorda area of South Florida. This would be the first time that we have spent any extended time in Florida during the winter, so we just don't know how we might react. If we don't go to Florida before your trip, we would be happy for you to drop by. On the other hand, if we go to Florida before your trip, we could stop by and see you in Destin. Keep in mind that we will be traveling in our motorhome and we would be staying in an RV campground. We can just about go any direction on our way home. We probably won't spend more than about 2 months in Florida next winter, which means that you could stop in Louisville to see us on your way back to Minnesota. Anyway, keep in touch and we can make plans when the time is right. I was certainly glad to learn that you remembered the Chinese gentleman that sang My Blue Heaven in English during Putnam and my stay in your home in South China. Dr. Tsung was a most interesting person. I have told the story about him at least 1,000 times. Many thanks for sending me the photos of your father. I really didn't get a chance to know him because the time spent at his headquarters was very brief. The arrangements made to get Putnam and me back to our air bases worked very well without any problems. I have asked some Chinese friends here in Louisville to translate the Chinese written material that was included with the photos. I noticed that you too have a computer and are using Microsoft Word Processor. This is a good program, and I enjoy using it for letters such as this. I've tried using Word to write 2 different newsletters that I somehow volunteered to edit, however, Word is difficult to use for this purpose. Microsoft Publisher is much easier to use, and I will probably switch back to Publisher next time. You must have a very effective printer because your copies are very clear and precise. Is this inkjet or laser? We look forward to hearing from you, and remember, you have an open invitation to visit us in Louisville. Yours very truly, Leonard Odell, August 23rd, 1996. PK and Lydia Lee. Dear PK and Lydia, many thanks for your letter of July 13th. It was interesting to learn where you spend your winter months in Destin. Your condo Jetty East is just about due south of the Destin Army Recreation Area campground, where we hope to stay while in Florida for the 23rd Fighter Group reunion in October. We will have some spare time while there, and we'll drive over to your home away from home and look around. A week or so before we got your letter, my wife's bridge group of ladies played at our house, and one of them commented that their condo in Destin was very close to the Army campground. We got out the map showing the campground, and sure enough, it was close. Then my wife went to another bridge evening again the following week, and she took along the brochure that you sent on Jetty East. Guess what? Her condo is next door to Jetty East. Another small world. Dash, 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 dash. Additional comments. During our winter travels to Florida, we met with Alan Putnam and his wife in Punta Gorda RV Park. It was such a pleasure seeing him after 53 years had elapsed. We had a very nice conversation about what had happened to each of us during in the intervening years, and we learned that Punta Gorda, Florida, had been part of the area that Alan had supervised during his working years. We also learned that his wife's father, years ago, had farmed the beachfront land along the nearby coast, and a recreation area is named after him. Another Small World. Part 4, Small World Reunion, June 27, 2000, PK. And I had communicated by phone and by U.S. Postal Service many times during the following 4 years, after I discovered that the Chinese gentleman that was such a big help in China now lived in the United States. But we had never had an opportunity to greet each other person to person. Finally, while attending an engineering society meeting in Minneapolis, I arranged to meet with PK and his wife Lydia on June 27, 2000, after a long 56-year wait. What a pleasant experience. PK Lee and his wife Lydia and their two daughters, Wendy and Lydia Lee, along with Lydia Lee's husband, Michael O'Donnell, and PK's grandson, his son's child, met me at the Minneapolis hotel where I was staying. I had a most delightful time renewing our acquaintance and my meeting of their family. PK's two sons, one present in China with Shu Fun, could not get off work. After a brief photo session, we said goodbye temporarily to my new friends, and PK and Lydia took me for a brief tour of their city and for a visit to the renowned Mall of the Americans. What a fabulous place. There were hundreds of stores and an atrium-type amusement park that seemed to be as big as of Disney World. I had heard a great deal about this place, but it was even bigger than I had imagined. From there, we proceeded to Lydia Lee and Mike's home for just a few minutes before going to nearby Calhoun Beach Club, where we continued getting acquainted and had lunch on their veranda overlooking one of Minneapolis's beautiful lakes. It was a beautiful, sunshiny day. It was learned that PK and his family had come to the USA shortly after World War II, lived and worked in New York City for 10 years before moving to Minneapolis. He worked as a chemist for Minneapolis Mining for 27 years before retiring a few years ago. His daughter Wendy, from San Francisco, was visiting while I was there. Lydia Lee and Mike live in Minneapolis and both work for the local Board of Education. Mike, who is originally from Duluth, teaches English in school, and it was interesting to learn that he speaks fluent Chinese and that they have made several trips to China. All of the family members were eager to hear some of the details of Alan Putman and my trip from their old family home area in China back to our air bases. Some of the details of our walkout were reiterated, at least enough to satisfy their curiosity. More details have been covered earlier in this write-up that they may also find interesting. I must admit that I had forgotten some of the finer points that had to be clarified by looking through my notes. I told them that I had been encouraged by my son to put the whole episode in writing, as it would perhaps make a good addition to the 76th Fighter Squadron website. In fact, as I write, this story article, Another Small World, will be included in the website that is being put together by my son Douglas Odell, webmaster. Its internet website address is https://thevanguard.bizland.com. PK advised that the book that he has written, entitled My Father Li Qi, Shen, is presently being printed in China, in Chinese. One chapter in it presently describes the rescue of two downed U.S. Air Force fighter pilots during 1944. He expressed the desire to update and expand the account using my input from this article. I told him that he could use any or all of it, but that he would have to translate it for me. I presented a miniature CBI flag set, China, India, Burma, and USA, to PK and Lydia as a very small token of appreciation for their friendship and help many years ago. After saying goodbye to Wendy, Lydia Lee, and Mike, we continued our tour of Minneapolis and then drove out to the 3M office complex. Quite a large facility. We visited their employees' sales building and found many desirable products that could be purchased for practically nothing. What a tempting place. I didn't realize that 3M made so many consumer products. It was certainly an interesting visit with some fine people that had befriended me many years ago. It is hoped and pray that they will be able to come to visit me sometime soon in Louisville, Kentucky. It is indeed another small world that we live in. Leonard J. Odell.